This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse murder and their families. I'm your host, Lane, and this is episode 180, The West Memphis 3, with Dan Stidham. On the evening of May 5th, 1993, three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, went missing in West Memphis, Arkansas. The next day, in a nearby wooded area, the boys were found brutally murdered, bound, and submerged in a drainage ditch. The horrific nature of the crime shocked the community, and police quickly arrested three local teenagers, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, based on a coerced false confession, no solid evidence, and satanic panic. This is the story of three innocent children whose lives were stolen in an unspeakable act of violence. It's also the story of three wrongfully convicted teenagers who spent 18 years in prison, one of them on death row, for a crime they didn't commit, the victims of a flawed justice system and a community in the grip of fear. In today's episode, I'm honored to discuss a case that has gripped me for many years with the one man who has been involved since the beginning, Jessie Misskelley's original defense attorney, case advocate, and author of the recent book, A Harvest of Innocence, Judge Dan Stidham. This is our discussion about his book and the tragic case of the West Memphis 3. My introduction to this case was in 2010 when True TV's crime library was still online and flourishing. I'd heard about the West Memphis 3 case, but never dug into it until I read the crime library article about it, which turned many of my perceptions upside down. This case made me realize that the American justice system is imperfect and very much fallible. It made me realize that law enforcement, the prosecution, and even court judges aren't always the good guys. Without question, it ended my fence-sitting on the topic of the death penalty. Above all else, it made me understand that at the time, three men were sitting in prison in Arkansas for a crime they didn't commit, one of whom faced execution, and the killer of three little boys had never faced justice. Although this won't be one of my typical deep dives, I'll give a brief overview for those unfamiliar with the case. The West Memphis 3 case is a deeply complex and tragic story involving the brutal murder of three young boys and the wrongful conviction of three teenagers. The case has received widespread attention over the past 31 years, igniting debates about the criminal justice system, media influence, false confessions, and the potential for bias in high-profile cases. On May 5, 1993, three 8-year-old boys, best friends and Cub Scouts James Michael Moore, Stephen Edward Branch, and Christopher Mark Byers, were reported missing in West Memphis, Arkansas. The next day, Michael, Stevie, and Chris's bodies were discovered in a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. The boys had been murdered, bound with their shoelaces, and left underwater in a drainage ditch. The severity of the injuries, particularly to Christopher Byers, who had suffered genital mutilation, led the West Memphis police to suspect that the killings were part of a satanic ritual. The murders shocked the small community, and immediately the pressure was on to find whoever was responsible. The media took the idea of satanic involvement and ran with it, which only added to the public's fear and demand for quick justice. Within the weeks following the murders, the police focused their investigation on three local teenagers, 18-year-old Damien Echols, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, and 17-year-old Jessie Misskelley Jr. The three boys were known to be outsiders, with Damien in particular standing out due to his interest in the occult and his unconventional appearance. This made them easy targets amidst the growing hysteria surrounding the case. Jessie Misskelley, who had a reported IQ of 72, was interrogated by police for hours without a lawyer or his father present. During this interrogation, he eventually gave a confession telling police what they wanted to hear, which included implicating Jason and Damien. However, Jessie's confession was riddled with inconsistencies and factual errors, including incorrect details about the crime itself, the crime scene, and the timing of events. Even so, Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell, when asked how solid he felt their case was on a scale of 1 to 10, replied smugly, 11. The prosecution also built its case around the so-called confession. The evidence against the 3 teenagers was circumstantial at best. There was no physical evidence whatsoever linking them to the crime scene. Instead, the prosecution relied on Jessie's false confession, Damien's interest in the occult, Jason wearing heavy metal band t-shirts, and the testimony of questionable witnesses. Meanwhile, heavily prosecution-biased Judge David Burnett suppressed testimony from renowned expert witnesses for the defense, but allowed so-called occult expert Dale Griffiths to testify for the prosecution despite the man's Ph.D. being awarded by a mail-order university. In 1994, after 2 separate trials, all 3 defendants were convicted. Jessie Misskelley Jr. was tried first, convicted, and sentenced to life plus 40 years. Jason Baldwin received life without parole. Damien Echols, who the prosecution considered the ringleader, was sentenced to death. The convictions were seen by many as a miscarriage of justice, but at the time, the public largely accepted the verdicts. As the years passed, more and more doubts about Jessie, Jason, and Damien's guilt began to surface. Legal experts, journalists, and filmmakers began to scrutinize the case, uncovering flaws in the investigation and trial. The 1996 HBO documentary, Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, brought the case to national and international attention. The film highlighted the lack of physical evidence, the questionable tactics used by the police, and the rush to judgment by the community and the media. Support for the West Memphis 3 grew, with many believing they were wrongfully convicted due to their status as outsiders in a conservative community, rather than based on solid evidence. High-profile figures, including musicians and celebrities, joined the campaign to free them, raising awareness and funds for their legal defense. Among the supporters were Pearl Jam's singer Eddie Vedder, Natalie Maines of the band then called the Dixie Chicks, actors Johnny Depp and Winona Ryder, and many more. In 2007, DNA testing, which had not been available at the time of the original trials, revealed that none of the genetic material found at the crime scene matched Damien, Jason, or Jessie. Instead, a hair found in the knots used to bind one of the victims was consistent with the DNA of Terry Hobbs, who was, at the time of the murders, Stevie Branch's stepfather. However, this was not enough to conclusively prove Hobbs's involvement or to exonerate the 3 men. After years of legal battles and increasing pressure from supporters and advocates, a major breakthrough occurred in 2011. Instead of granting them a new trial, in a rare legal maneuver, the West Memphis 3 were allowed to enter Alfred Pleas. This type of plea allowed them to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict them. In exchange, their sentences were reduced to time served, and they were released from prison on the spot after 18 years. No one could explain why, if the state of Arkansas truly believed Jason, Damien, and Jessie were responsible for 3 brutal child murders, they were fine with letting them walk out of prison. The Alfred Plea was a bittersweet resolution. While it allowed the men to regain their freedom, it also meant that they could not sue the state for wrongful imprisonment, and the case remains officially closed with their convictions still technically standing. For a massive number of people, the truth about who murdered Chris Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch in 1993 remains elusive. While some point to Terry Hobbs as a potential suspect, no new charges have been brought, and many consider the case unsolved. The families of the victims have been divided. All of the parents initially believed the West Memphis 3 were guilty. Over the years, Chris Byers' stepfather, John Mark Byers, and Stevie Branch's mother, Pamela Hobbs, came to believe in the men's innocence. Stevie's former stepfather, Terry Hobbs, as well as Michael's parents, Todd and Dana Moore, stand firm in the belief that Damien, Jessie, and Jason are guilty. The three men themselves have had to rebuild their lives after spending their formative years behind bars. Damien Echols, who was on death row, has become an advocate for criminal justice reform, writing books and speaking out about his experiences. Jason Baldwin co-founded Proclaim Justice, a nonprofit organization in Texas dedicated to freeing the victims of wrongful conviction. Jessie Misskelley Jr. reportedly lives a quiet life in West Memphis with his dad. There are many sources that I highly recommend checking out if you want all the details on this incredibly complex case. I'll include links in the show notes. The Paradise Lost trilogy is required viewing. The 3 HBO documentaries were released in 1996, 2000, and 2011. The deepest dive I've ever heard was on the podcast Truth and Justice with Bob Ruff. Bob dedicated the entire 5th season of that podcast, over 40 full-length episodes, to investigating this controversial case himself to determine if the 3 convicted teenagers were guilty or innocent. No matter how you feel about Bob himself or this case, it's impossible to hear that season and deny that he put more work into his investigation than the West Memphis police did theirs. Bob was also part of an Oxygen docuseries titled The Forgotten West Memphis 3. Throughout the 31 years since the child murders in Robin Hood Hills, there has been one staunch advocate for the West Memphis 3's innocence. That person is current Judge Dan Stidham, Jessie Misskelley Jr.'s original defense attorney, who represented him before, during, and after his trial and through multiple appeals, and he has made good on a promise he made to Jessie after the unthinkable verdict was rendered, that he would never abandon him or give up on him. Judge Stidham's account of the West Memphis 3 story has been untold until he recently released his book, A Harvest of Innocence, in which he pulled no punches in describing his side of the story. I thought I knew this case inside and out, but there were a ton of details in this book that shocked me. If you're at all interested in the case, I highly recommend reading this book. I recently had the honor of interviewing Judge Stidham about his book and his involvement in the West Memphis 3 case. I'm thrilled to bring you that conversation now, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I really appreciate this. I've been following the case for 13 years. I just started reading up on it in 2010. I had heard the name before, the West Memphis 3. It's obviously a famous case, but I hadn't really dug into it. And then, of course, as soon as I did, everything started coming together, and I've admired you for a long time for all of your contributions.
That's very kind.
And reading the book, it really came clear how much you actually did and how much you sacrificed. These guys are extremely lucky that you were involved. I think that the 3 little boys, of course, have to be remembered in all of this.
Absolutely.
It's a balance because there's 6 children who were victimized.
It's very horrible what happened to them, and I hope we can solve this case. I still have confidence that we can.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I was going to ask you because it has been going on for 30 years now, and it's, 31. But yeah, it's about time, I would say.
It seems like yesterday to me, which is kind of scary, but I'm actually the judge who sits on the bench in Corning where we had the trial.
Wow.
So it looks a little bit different from up there. And every time I go into that courthouse, I look out at that really small courtroom and wonder how we did all that with all the cameras and all the media. And of course, there wasn't very many people that could fit in the courtroom itself. But back then, when I was 30 years old instead of 61 years old, it just seemed a lot bigger than it does now.
Yeah, I bet it did. I'm sure it was pretty imposing for all of you on that side. The perspective has to be very, very different from all of us watching from the outside. It is a totally different world than what you experienced and the defendants experienced. And I was struck by the fact that yours was such a fresh perspective on what's become such a well-known and constantly rehashed case. What made you decide to write the book 30 years later?
Well, that's a good question, and I get asked that a lot. I actually started journaling throughout the trial process and immediately after the trial, especially because I woke up the day after Mr. Misskelley was convicted, and suddenly I didn't have anything to do. I didn't have all these large quantities of information to dissect and read quickly, and I had some time on my hands, so I started writing. And That way I could keep track of everything as the years went by. And the appellate process, of course, took 18 years and 78 days that they were incarcerated.
Yeah, that's tragic right there.
Almost 2 decades, yes. At that point, in 2011, when they were released through this thing we call an Alfred Plea, it seemed like a victory to me because I got to keep my promise to my client that I am going to get you out. And even though I knew the odds were very, very slim, I was determined to make sure that he got out of prison. And so the Alfred Plea did allow that to happen, but it was imperfect in that it left them all three with felony convictions.
And no hope of any restitution. That's the sad part.
Exactly. There was a couple of other factors that were involved. The Alfred Plea, which I was not an architect of, didn't even find out about it until the night before. Literally, in fact, I was pretty sure I was the last one that Mr. Ellington contacted about what was going on.
Oh, interesting.
And he said, be sure and keep this top secret. We don't want anybody to find out what's going on. And within 10 minutes, CNN was announcing that a mysterious hearing was taking place at the Craig County Courthouse the following morning. So it didn't stay top secret very long. I shared the news with my fiance, and of course, she was overjoyed.
Oh, I'm sure.
So I immediately called John Phillipsborn, who represented Jason Baldwin, and he and I had become not just colleagues, but good friends. And because I was puzzled by the fact that we were really expecting a new trial. The case had been remanded by the Arkansas Supreme Court, and everybody, including the state's attorneys, were expecting that we were going to get a new trial. And suddenly, without warning, this just bam. And when I called John in San Francisco, I said, hey, what in the hell is going on? I thought we were getting new trials. And he said, yeah, it's happening. I don't like it. It's nauseating, but it's going to happen. So he was in the middle of a capital murder trial in California, and the judge in that case would not let him call Jason Baldwin and discuss the plea with him. So it was very frustrating for him as well. And
no doubt.
But our conversation was literally 45 seconds long, maybe a minute at most. And he had to get off the phone because the judge was not real happy about him not concentrating on what was in front of him. So I walked into this thing kind of blindfolded.
Right. It had to be a surprise.
It was a shock. I became a witness in 2008, and I was on the witness stand off and on in 2008 and 2009. I got divorced in 2008, my 45th birthday. And as I stated in the book, my wife, and I don't blame her, she just was tired of me being obsessed with the case.
Yeah.
And she wanted a divorce, and I didn't want to do that to our children, but it ultimately happened. And she blamed the case, and we've worked through that. It's been a long time ago, and my kids were very supportive and understanding of what was going on. And the things that happened that day is, of course, the celebrities, a few of them showed up at the hearing, Eddie Vedder and Natalie Maines, who worked hard on the case and donated funds and energy to the case, which is exactly what we needed to get through.
Yeah. You had a lot to do with every aspect of the case. Just reading your perspective was so interesting to me because it was so different from everything that I've read, seen. I remember that day in August 2011. From the outside perspective, I was absolutely floored. I had a chalk marker and I wrote WM3 are free on my car and just drove it all over the place. It was so exciting. And just drumming up that kind of support for the case. I wanted to ask you too, do you think that without the Paradise Lost documentaries, it would have gained traction in some way anyway?
No, not at all. If it hadn't been for the Paradise Lost films, we would have never got to the finish line. And the irony of that is that the law in Arkansas is that if anyone objects to the cameras being in the courtroom, whether it be the prosecution or the defense, the judge is not allowed to have the cameras in the courtroom. And we all said no.
Oh, that's interesting. But it wouldn't be the only law or procedure that someone flaunted in that case.
Well, my situation was I was 30 years old, and the media attention was just so intense nationally and internationally, for that matter. And the last thing I needed was what I thought would be a distraction in the courtroom. But Judge Burnett just said, nope, we're doing it. We're having cameras in the courtroom. They're going to do an HBO film, and we're doing it. And so I thought, well, that's what's going to happen. And there's the first sign that things were not going to go well. Him being involved in the case and then allowing the cameras. But thank God for those cameras, because if it hadn't been for that first documentary, it got quite a bit of attention. And I wish that it had come out before the Arkansas Supreme Court worked on the direct appeal. We came down with their ruling, but it didn't. So we were flabbergasted at the decision, 7-0. Found out later that there were some shenanigans about that as well, which I won't go into specifically because I don't want to give away everything in the book.
Exactly. Read the book.
But if it hadn't been for the HBO guys. And then all of a sudden, Peter Jackson, Brandon Walsh, Amy Berg showed up and started doing a documentary. And they asked me to participate. And so I did. I wanted to do everything I could to help with my client to get out of prison. So they had concluded the film and were in New Zealand editing the film with Damien Echols helping them edit from prison. But he soon joined them after the Alfred Plea. So they flew back, literally, and we shot one more scene at Trailer Park where Mr. Misskelley lived, Mr. Misskelley Sr., and where Mr. Misskelley Jr. was taken from in 1993 on June 3rd when he gave his false confession. And so getting back to your original question, the reason it took so long is the Alfred Plea. When I got to the courthouse that next day, they wouldn't let me into the jury room where they were holding the West Memphis 3. I wanted to speak to my client. I hadn't seen him in some time, and I wanted to visit with Jason and Damien, and the court security officer said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I can't let you in here without Judge Laser's permission. So I had to get Judge Laser's permission, and I guess I'll spoil this, but he asked me as I was walking out of his chambers, he said, Dan, you're not going to try to derail this train, are you? And I said, why would I do that? My client's going home today. That's been the goal from the beginning. And so he said, okay. And for years, I didn't know why he said that. He asked me to get permission from Jeff Rosenzweig, who was Jessie's appellate attorney. And of course, he said, fine, sure, go ahead and visit with him. And as I turned to walk away, he stopped me and he said, hey, Dan, he said, you know we were going to get a new trial, right? I said, yeah, but so why are we doing this?
Right.
And he just kind of shrugged, and I thought, someday perhaps I'll understand this, but I don't understand it now. But it seemed like a gift from God at that moment. So I got upstairs, went into the jury room, and Damien looked like he had already passed away. I've never seen anyone that ashen and cold to the touch and still be alive. He was nervous that something was going to go wrong. And then, of course, we all were. Everyone was. It's one of those things you got to see to believe because of all the times we got close before but didn't quite make the hurdle. Of course, Jesse's Jessie. He's has MR, intellectually disabled. And back then, we called it mental retardation. Today, it's more softly and gently referred to as MR. He was just happy as he could be to go home. And who could blame him? And when I got to Jason immediately said, Dan, am I doing the right thing? And I said, yeah, you're going home to see your mom tonight. I carried around a lot of guilt about that after I discovered in the 10 years that followed what was going on, what was actually occurring. I didn't understand it, but it seemed like a good idea. As the months and years went by, I experienced this horrible bitterness as the truth began to seep out and seep through, because I felt cheated personally, because I had been kicked in the teeth so many times and thrown under the bus by the Arkansas Supreme Court and by the trial judge, and the U.S. Supreme Court would not grant certs, and that's not that uncommon. They only hear a very few amount of cases per year. But I took a lot of blows.
Yeah.
There were pieces of me on the battlefield that are still there. I became very bitter, and it began to come through in my writing. And Dr. Tim Durning, who was a forensic psychologist, he got involved in the case after Eddie Vedder had convened some of the best lawyers in the country in Seattle. And we all had a meeting, and he decided to help with the case. And so suddenly we had some funding and some appellate lawyers to work with, because it was just me by myself from 1994 to 2000, the year 2000.
Wow.
And I couldn't find anyone in the state of Arkansas willing to represent any of the clients. Well, the only two that I still had the Rule 37 hearings left were Jason and Jessie, but no one wanted to touch it. It was a hot potato politically and otherwise, and nobody would help out. So finally, we've got counsel from outside the state of Arkansas. And I don't know the details. I never wanted to know. But Jeff Rosenzweig and Blake Hendricks came on as local counsel, and we started reinvestigating the case with funds from Peter Jackson and the other celebrities involved. Winona Ryder did a fundraiser for us in L.A., and so Peter Jackson spent, I can't tell you how much he spent for doing the film and hiring the experts, but we literally had the best attorneys and the best experts you could find. And by the end of, after the initial round of DNA testing in 2007, we had excluded the West Memphis 3 and included one of Terry Hobbs' friends, David Jacoby, who obviously was at the scene because his hair was found on a tree stump. And then there was a hair found in the ligatures used on the victim, Michael Moore. Mm-hmm. And it was a match, but not a complete enough match that we could say definitively, to the exclusion of all others, that this was Terry Hobbs. But it was in the neighborhood, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So suddenly he started being investigated by our investigative team, and witnesses began to recant. And by the end of 2007, it was pretty much over for the state of Arkansas. But instead of saying, hey, you know what? We made a mistake. We're sorry. We understand now that there's no such thing as satanic ritual homicide. There's never been a single case documented on the planet. We apologize, and here's some reparations for the grief we caused you and costing you 18 years and 78 days of your life, the prime of your life.
Yeah.
But instead, they dug in deeper. They doubled down, and they could find no expert willing to testify that our experts were wrong.
I'll pause here for a quick sponsor break.
The medical examiner in Arkansas who did the autopsy, Dr. Predation, had flunked his national board exams 4 times.
Oh my gosh.
Before he finally gave up. And he came to the conclusion that this was satanic and the injuries were made with a knife. And I actually did some stalking, which is not the best thing for a lawyer to do. But
like you said in the book, you're a ninja, so you can get away with it.
That's right. I had to be a ninja. And I went to San Francisco and literally stalked Dr. Michael Baldwin, who then was considered one of the best forensic specialists on the planet. He had his own show on HBO, can't remember, Autopsy. I think was the name of it. And he was the guy. So I just happened to catch him in the elevator with a forensic entomologist, which is for lay people, that's an insect guy who knows how to calculate time of death by insects. And so I was glad to meet him. And so there was another forensic odontologist in the elevator. And on the way up, I somehow convinced them all to come and look at these pictures and just point me in the right direction. And they agreed. So within a couple of hours of arriving at the scene of the meeting that they were at, I had three of the best forensic guys looking at the pictures. And I remember, like it was yesterday, Dr. Michael Baldwin picking up the picture of the victim, Christopher Byers, whose genitals had been mutilated. It was just horrible. And he picked up that picture and he looked at it and he said, "That's animal predation." He says, "This is not three teenagers pulling this off. This is not a satanic ritual. There's nothing satanic about it. It's animal predation." And we started talking about what type of animals could cause this. And turtles were the main culprit discussed. Mm-hmm. And of course, there were the possibility of raccoons and coyotes, believe it or not, and even feral dogs, or there's insects that will feed on bodies, according to the entomologist. Fish, crawfish. That's why I don't have a pet, because the minute you pass away, you're food.
Right. Supposedly the dog is less inclined to do that than the cat, but
that's what I understand. But I don't want to have either. So they go for the soft tissue, and unfortunately, that's the face, the lips, the ears, the nose, and genitals. And I had stared at those photographs for 10 years trying to figure out what made these marks. And we had a volunteer in the film, West of Memphis, Peter Jackson's film, that let an alligator snapping turtle bite him on the arm. And there was that triangular shape on his arm, the mark on his arm with the little dimple where the beak. Turtles have beaks like a bird, or a bird of prey, I should say. And it makes a little indentation, it reminded me of a Phillips head screwdriver, actually.
Okay.
And so when I saw that, I thought, oh my God, that's what happened. And in the movie, they actually conduct an experiment that Dr. Haskins, who was the forensic entomologist in San Francisco that I met, we talked about doing experiments in the creek where the bodies were found to see how long it would take with a baby pig, and see how long it would take with a camera for the predators to show up and start feeding on the body. And of course, by the time West of Memphis was filmed, the landscape had changed. The creek didn't exist. They put culverts in and bulldozed it. And I noticed the other day when I was coming back from Nashville from CrimeCon that some of the trees had started to grow back on the lot there where the bodies were discovered. So I've always wondered what those people that are staying in those motels that are next to the site, as they're looking to the east, if they have any idea what happened all these years ago, just outside their windows. It's kind of freaky. So the next thing, to answer your question, I know I'm going down several rabbit holes here at once, but
that's okay.
Why did it take 10 years? There was a couple of reasons. The number one being, part of the deal was that they had a suspended imposition of sentence, which meant that if they got into trouble for any reason, then they would go back to prison. So Mr. Misskelley, of course, wanted to go back to where his father was, and who could blame him? And with his intellectual disabilities, he didn't want to go anywhere else. The Center for the Wrongful Convictions of the Youth offered to put Mr. Misskelley into a halfway house for people who were acclimating themselves after being released for wrongful convictions for young people. And he declined. Of course, he didn't want to live in Chicago that far from his father. I knew he wasn't going to do that.
No.
But Peter Jackson actually offered to buy him a house, a brand new house in Mississippi across the river. But Jessie wouldn't go. So it didn't take long for the cops to start picking on him. Mm-hmm. And he drove a car with no insurance and no driver's license, no registration, because his girlfriend had been drinking and she couldn't drive and he didn't want her to get in trouble. And foolishly, she convinced him to do it. And so he went to jail for something that most people would have gotten a citation for.
Right.
And of course, I was so angry, I immediately went down there, made arrangements for him to have an attorney, actually made a couple phone calls to people I knew on the WM3.org website, and they spread the word around the world. In a matter of 20 minutes, we'd raised money to pay all his fines and costs, and he was released.
That's awesome.
And I told him, I said, if you pick on him again, we'll be right back on you. The world is watching, so you better leave him alone.
Yeah.
And so they're still watching. And that's part of writing the book, is letting people know the truth about what happened. I was the only one who was there from the first day to the last. So I wanted to get past that 10-year SIS period because I didn't want to put a target on them, because I heard my book was not going to be well received in West Memphis and Crittenden County. The West Memphis police were not going to like it at all. Not that they ever liked me to begin with, but I just didn't want to put a target on anybody, especially Jessie. We actually got finished with the first draft in 2005, and I started collaborating with my co-author, Tom McCarthy, who was retired from the publishing business in New York. And he began to shop our manuscript around. And all we got was, why? Why would we do that? What could possibly be new about this case? And
they're living under a rock, I guess.
They were. And, then, and just as we were about to self-publish, we got the final manuscript completed. And we're just about ready to launch, and my son passed away.
I'm so sorry. It's just awful.
So I had a new insight into not exactly what the parents of the three victims went through, but I certainly got a good glimpse at it. So it took me quite a while. And of course, I learned you don't ever get over something like that. You just learn to live with it. And at least I got 34 years out of Chris, whose birthday was the day the kids were released. I call them kids. They're not kids. They're middle-aged men.
Well.
But his birthday was the day they were released, August 19th. And we had a birthday party for Chris. And he said, Dad, this is the best birthday present I've ever received, is watching those kids get out of prison. He was one of my biggest supporters when it came to the case. I had 2 older kids and 2 younger kids. They were spaced out. The youngest was 10 years younger than the oldest. And Chris was my second born. And he was my campaigner. And I ran for judge and ran for re-election. I had one opponent over the years. And this is my 24th year on the bench. So I miss him a lot. There's still bad days, but after almost 3 years now, the good days outweigh the bad, and I still get sad and feel bad, but I felt that it was important after that experience to go back and pour the book, the entire book, through a couple of filters, but primarily the filter of losing a child, to just make sure I gave the victims and their parents the respect they deserved, and also to point out to them that they didn't deserve what they got from the West Memphis police and the prosecution and the criminal justice system here in Arkansas. I just didn't want to reopen any wounds for them, so I poured it through that filter, and I hope I was successful in that.
Yeah, it was very compassionate, I thought.
And I was as hard on myself as I was anybody in the book. I made mistakes. It was my first jury trial, so as first chair, I'd been involved in a couple as a second chair, and I'd actually worked on a couple capital murder cases before while I was in law school, and also a attempted capital murder case here in my hometown of Paragould, Arkansas. So it wasn't like I just got off the turnip truck, and I did have some experience, but not quite the experience that I needed to be involved in such a complex case. I succeeded in getting 2 of the best experts on police interrogation techniques and the polygraph, and also what was then, just like DNA, a new and emerging science of false confessions.
Yeah.
And over the years, I got to work with some of the best people doing studies on false confessions, and they're very, very real. Absolutely. But back in 1993, no one could wrap their mind around the fact that someone would confess to something they didn't do, despite their mental deficits. So I felt like we should have won at the trial level, but because of the court's way of muting our experts who came on their own dime, I didn't have any money to pay them. I did pay for a hotel room for them the night before they testified at the suppression hearing. and they flew straight in and straight out when they testified at the trial. But the judge limited their testimony so much that the jury never got to hear the good stuff.
Yeah, very frustrating.
And then there was the jury misconduct that I don't want to get into in too much detail because it's one of the aha moments of the case. And also it highlighted one of the biggest mistakes I made. We thought we were going to win, so we didn't make a motion for mistrial. We should have, could have, but we were so afraid that if we did, the judge would grant it because he knew he'd messed up. And then we'd found out later that the jury was going to acquit him. We wouldn't have been able to live with ourselves. So we chose not to make the motion and didn't realize that we could do both at the same time. So that's just the inexperience, which, I can't go back and change it. But to this day, I still struggle with watching Paradise Lost, the first installment, because watching those courtroom scenes, the only exciting thing about it is I had hair then. Now I don't. Very little, I should say. After that, there was no criminal proceeding that gave me any pause or discomfort. I felt like I could tackle the world after that. So my dad always told me that that's the best way to learn how to swim is to get thrown in the lake.
Time for another sponsor break. Is it the most frustrating case you've ever had to either preside over or defend someone?
Yes, absolutely. There's no comparison. And being a judge now, that's the part that I miss the most is trying cases. But I had a chance to become a full-time judge in 2008 as I was getting divorced because I couldn't be a lawyer in the case anymore because I was a witness. So I thought, well, I'm not abandoning my client by participating in this pilot project, which was very successful. And I'm proud of the fact that my judicial district ended up being the model for the entire judicial system for district courts in Arkansas.
That's great.
I'm very proud of that fact. The other filter I had to pour this thing through is Dr. Durning, who came in and examined Mr. Misskelley in 2004, which was 10 years after the conviction, and 6 years after I learned that this was animal predation and not a satanic ritual. He interviewed Mr. Misskelley and determined that not only was he what we referred to back then as mentally retarded, but he wasn't even fit to stand trial. He could not assist us in defending him, and he didn't understand what a lawyer was. He thought my partner and I were cops until about halfway through the course of the case. And of course, naturally, at first I assumed he was guilty because I didn't understand the dynamics of a false confession. But I do have a degree in sociology. So when I was referred to Dr. Offshay, Richard Offshay from the University of California at Berkeley, it's a little known university out west somewhere. And I say that jokingly because he had a real PhD and
not a mail order.
Not a mail order PhD like
Amazing.
A cult expert did in the next trial 3 weeks later.
I can't roll my eyes hard enough on that one.
That one just baffles me, and it's probably the best example of just how biased the judge was.
Yes.
In fact, when he classified Dr. Griffiths, who was a retired police officer from Ohio, when he said he could testify as an expert, he even used the language, well, even a third grader that can help the jury understand the issues can be qualified as an expert. And I thought, Dr. Offshay is not a third grader.
No.
So that was distressing. But when it came time to write that chapter, which was one of the goals of my book, was to explain why Jessie Misskelley confessed, not just once, but several times. And I sent the chapter off to Dr. Durning in California for him to review to make sure I had gotten all his conclusions correctly. And he emailed me back and said, hey, you nailed it. Everything's correct. You did a good job. All the quotes are right. And I think you put it in layman's terms where anybody can understand. He said, why are you so pissed off? I said, what do you mean? He said, when it comes out in your writing, it's horrible. You're angry. And I said, well, I am angry. They threw me under the bus. They denied every appeal that I did. They messed with the jury in both cases. And I said, I'm just bitter about that. And I'm bitter about the fact that I never got to retry the case. So I knew that I had to get over that, and I had to work through that. And I took a Zen-like approach to that problem and took the middle way and decided that I wasn't going to let this bitterness destroy me, because it was eating me alive, and it was creating health problems for me, and this wasn't good for my soul. So I had to get rid of that. And I didn't want to come across in the book either, even though, as I said in the beginning of the book, I've earned the right to be bitter.
You sure have.
I'm no longer angry, because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of victimizing me in that way. And I also wanted to come across in the book as being not only passionate, but also believable and reliable. Yeah. So I removed all that from it. Some people might disagree, especially in West Memphis, but I was as tough on myself as I was everyone else who made major gaffes and errors in the case.
Some of them were on purpose.
Yes, they were. And then the patterns emerged. And before I forget, let me take this opportunity. And I've done a lot of podcasts and a lot of interviews. And most of the time, when I do radio interviews, I've got 5 or 10 minutes to try to talk about a 30-year-old case that still has litigation pending in it.
Yeah.
This case is very much still alive and still relevant. It's not ever left the headlines in 31 years. I'll even be so bold as to say it'll never leave the headlines, because it's basically the same thing that happened in Salem, Massachusetts 300 years ago, almost exactly 300 years ago.
Right.
And it's going to happen again, because when people are confronted with an evil that they can't wrap their mind around and they can't make sense of it, they are going to turn to the supernatural. They're going to turn to the boogeyman, because all they want, the community, is to feel safe again. They want this evil that has descended upon their town to just go away. And the best way to do that is to find scapegoats. And that's what they did.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about too, is so you do think that something this heinous and unjust could happen now, 2024, because it seems like this particular case was a perfect storm in a lot of ways, with the combination of satanic panic and small town closed-mindedness and religion and the corruption in the justice system and all that sort of thing.
Well, it's a classic good versus evil. And, the judge is a former prosecutor, and he never forgot that. I don't know if it actually happened, but one lawyer, it was said years earlier, before this trial happened in 93, had told Judge Burnett in open court, why don't you just, you and the prosecutors, get jerseys with your names on the back so it'll be obvious to everyone that you're on the same team. And I know who was allegedly said it, but I've never asked that person. But that's the way it was in our case.
Yeah, sure was.
There was one point where I was trying to introduce something that was obviously inadmissible, because it showed that what happened in the wounds on the bodies were not a secret. Everybody in West Memphis knew the wounds on the bodies. Mm-hmm. And it was a police report, and they're not admissible. And prosecutors said, we don't care. And Judge Burnett said, you mean you're going to let him introduce a police report? Are you sure? And I said, Your Honor, they said they had no objection. And he still asked him the second time, are you sure? And I said, Your Honor, how many times do I have to ask permission to do this? And he finally relented, and I was able to show the jury the exhibit. But you try to make your victories where you can get them, and sometimes you find them in small places. But it was just insane how biased the judge was.
He certainly was unprofessional and inappropriate in so many ways.
And he really made no effort to hide it whatsoever. He even was interviewed by the press, and the rules are you're not supposed to talk about a case that's pending before your court, especially to the media. And he told them that he had read a book on Satanism, which broadcasted to every potential juror out there that this was a satanic ritual homicide. which the FBI had completely debunked. There's never been a single case ever documented on the planet.
Right.
Are you kidding me? And the one time that I tried to manipulate the case in the press by telling reporters that Mr. Misskelley had passed the polygraph exam they gave him and told him that he was lying his ass off, quote unquote. That's what facilitated the increase in the interrogation process when they told him that he flunked the polygraph. Then they increased the pressure.
It's amazing to me that that's legal.
Well, it is to me too. I did a interview with, I think it was the Daily Mail, and we were talking about, she said, you know, in our system of justice, you automatically have an attorney in the room with you. The police can't even talk to you unless you have counsel present. And they can't lie to you. They can't tell you that we've got your DNA and we've got this witness or we've got this or that and the other. They can't do that. But their conviction rate is essentially the same. In fact, I wrote this down. I said, I'm going to use this because you said it, and I cannot recall her name. She referred to the confession as a happy accident, which I thought that was a great way for her to describe that.
It's a Bob Ross quote. That's what he always called his little problems in his paintings. He just turned it into something else.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Well, that gives me new perspective.
It was a great source.
Wow, that's good to know. After my book was published, my wife's daughter was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 37, and insurance companies will not pay for mammograms until you reach age 40.
Oh.
But breast cancer is a young woman's disease as well.
Yeah, it sure is.
And by the time she got the mammogram, her local doctor had told her not to worry about the lump in her armpit near her breast. And by the time she went and had the mammogram done, she was in stage 4 of cancer. Oh. And she passed away a little over a year ago. So we lost 2 children in the past 3 years. So it's been tough. But I like the fact that your podcast is about the victims, the little children, the little children, because these children did certainly suffer. And then 3 teenagers also suffered. And that's why I called the book, titled it Harvest of Innocence, because it basically took everyone who was involved. It was like a virus that spread with the Satanic panic and the judge being on the prosecution team and the misconduct, and a lot of things I didn't even know about until after the trials were over that I found out later. So what I would like to do is ask your listeners if they're from the Mid-South and know anything about this case. People are coming forward now. I don't know why they waited 30 years, but people are coming forward now and giving me new information. I've almost accumulated enough information, and it corroborates what's in the book already. So there's a pattern, a distinct pattern of misconduct on the part of the police. And of course, that's imputed to the prosecutor. So go to my website, danstidham.com, and send me an email to harvestofinnocence@outlook.com. I'd love to read your emails and have more information because sometimes the slightest little thing can be really, really important.
Yes.
And with the Arkansas Supreme Court just recently allowing Damien Echols, who petitioned the court to conduct some more advanced DNA testing, the trial court denied it, saying he wasn't a prisoner and couldn't avail himself of that.
There were so many denials in that one, yeah.
And they first said they didn't know where the file was. They said it burned up in fire. They said it was lost in a flood. And then they said it just was missing. And so they filed a lawsuit, a Freedom of Information lawsuit, because they wouldn't respond. And suddenly the file magically appeared in the evidence room.
Right.
In intact form. We're still trying to conduct an inventory to see if everything is there. But it looks like now that the court has remanded it and said the statute does not say you have to be incarcerated to do retesting on the evidence.
That's fantastic.
So they're now negotiating that. I've heard, I haven't been able to confirm it yet because I've been so busy. I don't know what day it is most of the time. So I haven't checked in with some of my colleagues, but I think this is going to be an effort on behalf of all the West Memphis 3. And this MVAC DNA extraction method, I got a personal look at it at CrimeCon in Nashville. There's a gentleman there who does that, and he had the machine there with him, and I got a demonstration.
Oh, that's great.
And it was amazing how this thing worked. It actually reminded me of a carpet cleaner because it had a little hose down the side of the vacuum, and it dispensed a liquid. I don't know if it was saline solution or what it was. I should have asked, but it didn't occur to me till after it was over. But he used a baseball cap and was extracting DNA, and it just literally creates a suction, and you can see all the material going up the hose. The hose was clear, and you can see it being collected in the machine, and it's the latest technology. And so this partial Terry Hobbs DNA sample may be fruitful to us.
Right. If they test the knots from the bindings, his DNA, the perpetrator's DNA, let's say, could be on there from either touch DNA, skin oils, whatever it is. It's amazing.
Of course, I hope they test more than that. I hope they test all the clothing that the kids were wearing. And of course, as a judge, I can't get in the middle of all that and do anything but watch from the sidelines. But I think we've got a really good shot at proving who this killer is.
Now, another quick pause to hear from my sponsors.
I have an alternate theory that I discuss in the book of an over-the-road truck driver and the crime scene where the kids were last seen riding their bicycles and their bodies were found the next day very near there. You could throw a baseball from the service road to the little ditch they were found in. And that's the third busiest interstate highway exchange in the country. And FedEx has its corporate headquarters across the river in Memphis because it's the center of the country. And so they distribute their packages from Memphis. And I'm sure they have other hubs as well, but there's about 8,000 to 10,000, 12,000 maybe as many as 15,000 big rigs that come through that small stretch of road where Interstates 40 and 55 converge for about a mile, 3/4 of a mile, and then separate again. And if you're heading west, you can merge to the right and go to St. Louis and Chicago. And if you merge to the left, you can go to Little Rock and then south on 30 to Dallas, further west on 40 and go all the way to the East Coast. There's literally been dozens of bodies discovered along the sides of Interstate 40, primarily in Oklahoma and in Arkansas and all across, going west and even east. But the suspect that I have, who used to be an over-the-road truck driver, I can put him in the area 2 years before the murders. We also have some other child murders that took place at approximately the same time as the West Memphis murders took place that, as far as I know, they haven't been solved. And each of the bodies were discovered in water, just like the 3 8-year-olds in West Memphis.
There's more than one theory, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm not going to leave any stone unturned. And I talk about this in the book. And the day of the Alfred Plea, I was introducing my fiance, now wife, Leanne, to Eddie Vedder and Natalie Maines. And court security officer tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Do you want to talk to this guy?" And I turned around, and it was John Mark Byers, who at one time was a suspect in the case.
6'8", giant man.
I'm a big guy, but he makes me look small. And he leaned down and whispered in my ear. He said, "Promise me you'll get the real killer. We both know who it is."
Okay.
And of course, he was referring to Terry Hobbs. And then Pam Hobbs, the mother of Stevie Branch, came up to me right behind Mr. Byers and said the same thing, "Promise me you'll find the real killer." And I had hoped to leave there that day with all this lifted off my shoulders and the burdens. but how could I say no?
Right. Especially since they switched camps.
Yeah, they were kind enough to come over to our side of the situation. So I told them I would. So I guess I'll spend the rest of what I have left of my life searching for the real killer. And with this advanced DNA, we got a shot.
Yes.
And I think we have a shot trying to, even if we get a full DNA profile that we can put in CODIS, we might get lucky or find similar cases.
Right. There's constantly cases that are solved by genetic testing, people who send their DNA into 23andMe and things like that. People are getting caught through their family members and things like that. It's amazing what's going on.
And also finding out that they have children they didn't know about.
Surprise.
I've had some clients who were surprised by that.
Oh, wow.
So it's a good thing. It really is. Genealogy is kind of the new thing. That's how they caught the California rapist.
Golden State Killer.
Yeah. It's just so difficult when it's kids. And unfortunately for me, I'm married to a state police supervisor for the Crimes Against Children Division. And she does it every day, all day, 24/7, just like I do my judge thing 24/7.
Wow.
And everything involves sexual assault or physical assault of children, and they get the worst of the worst cases.
Well, bless her for doing that.
I think it's starting to grate on her soul a bit. I'm surprised she's been able to do it as long as she has. She's pretty good at compartmentalizing things. I'm not as good at that as she is. I kind of more open, and especially when it was grieving. I had someone point out to me the other day that I was crying more than she was at her daughter's funeral, and that just, but that's her. Everybody has their own way of grieving, and it really bothered me. And I wear my emotions on my sleeve, and it was tough. It's tough on us both, but that's just something you never get over. You just have to learn to live with it.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry you both had to go through so much in the past few years, and you've had a very eventful 30 plus years. So at some point, do you think you'll be getting any amount of sleep or rest, relaxation?
Well, believe it or not, when the book was released, I felt like the world had been lifted off my shoulders immediately the minute that it went live. It took me a while to convince my co-author, Tom, because he was a diehard publisher and wasn't familiar with self-publishing on Amazon. It took me a while to convince him, but when I did convince him and we put it on Amazon, it took off like a rocket. And I now know that there's a truthful version of what happened. And it took me most of those 10 years waiting on the SIS to go away, the suspended imposition of sentence, but all these new things I kept uncovering about the Alfred Plea and who was on board and who wasn't. And, of course, you read the book, so you're familiar with what I wrote about. But I was shocked.
Yeah.
And the harder I tried to convince people to talk about it, the more they didn't want to. They wanted this to go away and be swept under the rug, and they could hide behind this Alfred Plea because they got convictions. And even though we were able to maintain our innocence, we still had the convictions.
Right.
So it was sort of like a tie football game, and everybody could claim they won. And that was another goal of my case, was to explain that Alfred Plea and how it came about. And I hope I was successful in doing that. I've been told that I was.
Yes, definitely.
And the younger the audience that I speak to, the more difficult it is. And I don't allow Alfred Pleas in my courtroom.
Oh, good.
Because it's either you did or you didn't, and we'll have a trial. People will come to me and enter a plea of guilty and then suddenly say, I didn't do this, but I'm going to plead guilty just to get it over with. And I said, no, you're not. I'll see you in a few weeks for trial, because nobody wants to admit that they did anything. They don't want to be held accountable. And I'm not going to permit that, because that's what happened in this case.
Yeah.
These men who prosecuted these kids and knew when it became so glaringly obvious that they were innocent, all they had to do was say, hey, you know what? We made a mistake. We got caught up in a satanic panic and we messed up. We all mess up. That's part of the human endeavor. But instead of paying them reparations and setting aside the convictions, they doubled down so that they could maintain their dignity, I guess, which would seem to be more important to them than the truth. So that's
Really
what this was about for me. When I stopped and prayed every morning at my church during the trial, I didn't ask to win, because there's no winners in this thing. Nobody won. That's why I call it the Harvest of Innocence, because there's no winners. And all I asked for was, Lord, please give me truth and justice. And it took a long time for that prayer to get answered. And it's still not a perfect solution, but I was able to keep my promise to get my client out of prison. And I'm still plugging away and working on the case, and will continue to do so as long as I'm physically able to do it. And I am super excited about this new round of testing.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I want to commend you for that promise that you made to Jessie right after his verdict, that you would never abandon him. That hit me hard, and you really have stuck to that. In the book, you humanized him in a way I haven't seen yet. All I could think the whole time I was reading, whenever you talked about him, was this poor little boy, because no matter how old he was then or gets, he has a very small physical presence, but also the functional age of his brain. I don't know exactly where it is, but it's quite a bit younger than he is, I would imagine.
It is. And Dr. Durning stated in his findings that 95 to 98% of the people that Mr. Misskelley encounters each day are intellectually superior to him. I say that not to make fun of or make him feel bad, but he just didn't understand what was going on. He never understood he could just get up and walk out of the police station at any time.
I'm sure they didn't make that known.
No, they didn't. And they lied to him, and they did all the things that you can't do in the UK. And I actually went to a couple murder trials when I was in London. There's no guns over there. I mean, I'm sure there are a few, but the bad guys have them, but the police don't carry guns. So the murder trials are all stabbings, which I think I'd rather be shot than stabbed.
That's a good point.
But I was amazed at the regalia of the criminal justice system there. The defendant was in the back of the courtroom. I don't know if it was bulletproof glass or if it was plexiglass or what it was, but he was at the very back of the courtroom being guarded. And then there were layers of lawyers and barristers, and the higher up you were in the echelon, you wore wigs, and their robes were just ornate. It really kind of stunned me at first. It just didn't seem normal to me, but it's like anything else. The first time you do something, it's just, you go, wow, I didn't expect that. But after a few minutes, I got acclimated to the situation. I thought, wow, this is really, really interesting to watch. And when I went into the Old Bailey there to watch the trials, it's like going to a theater. They have a balcony in the courtroom.
Wow.
For people to watch the trials. And so I told the bailiff that I was a judge in Arkansas, and he gave me a special tour and got me a front row seat. And so I got the great treatment.
Yeah, you got the star treatment.
Not that I deserved it, but I got it anyway.
I think some people might disagree with you on that.
But I enjoyed seeing how their system works. And I think we could benefit a little bit. That's another thing that I want to do with this case, and the legacy of this case is continue to work for criminal justice reform. There is no reason whatsoever why we should not be recording interrogations from the beginning to the end.
Right, exactly.
They had the technology in 1993 to do that. They just chose not to because they wanted to berate and lie to Mr. Misskelley. They didn't want anybody to see that. Or he was there 12 hours, and I'm not submitting that he was interrogated the entire 12 hours, but he was there from 9 a.m. and I think they locked him up about 9 p.m.
Wow.
The last time they talked to him was when they realized, oh my gosh, this is not going to work, because the kids were in school all day, and so was Jason Baldwin. And the kids were seen riding their bikes at 6:30 p.m. And so the deputy prosecutor came over and read the transcript and said, what's wrong with you people? I don't know what he said. I wasn't there, but I can imagine reading that and saying, you guys are cops and you're investigating, interrogating a suspect, and he tells you the murders happened at noon.
Right.
And the kids were in school, and Jason Baldwin was in school, and they were last seen right before dark on the service road by the interstate where their bodies were recovered the next day. And you don't think that's important?
Hence the extra 12-minute recording.
There's the other 12 minutes. And of course, we don't know what time that started because the officer doesn't put that on the tape. We don't know what time it ended. So we know it was after dark.
Yeah.
So when he walks back into the room during that 12-minute period, he starts out with, "Now, Jessie, earlier you told me this happened at 5 or 6. Was it 5 or 6 or 7 or 8? Even a kid with MR knows what the officer wants, and that's 7 or 8.
Yep.
And you can hear, when you listen to the audio of the tape, you can hear Inspector Gitchell just kind of going, like, "It's over. We got him." And
Mr. 11 out of 10.
Yeah, Mr. 11 out of 10. And nowhere in the 30 minutes or so of the first part of the confession did 5 or 6 ever come up.
Oh,
and
so
in their notes, it never come up. So he immediately went in and manipulated Ms. Kelly, just like he did through the entire confession. Steve Drisden, who is an outstanding attorney and professor at the University of Northwestern University in Chicago, and is co-founder of the Center for the Wrongful Convictions of the Youth. He said Jessie Misskelley didn't give a confession. Gary Gitchell gave a confession.
That's for sure.
And Mr. Misskelley never told them anything they didn't already know.
Right. They just put it in order for him to basically agree with.
And I submit to your listeners that if you are interrogating someone who claims that a rape and a murder occurred at 9 o'clock in the morning, and that gets changed to noon, and the officer has to ask Mr. Misskelley, "Do you know how to tell time?" That's kind of a red flag. And then at one point, he asked him if he knows what a penis is.
Right.
And even a 17-year-old intellectually disabled teenager knows what that is. So nothing that Mr. Misskelley described in that interrogation or any of the subsequent ones thereafter bore any relationship to the crime scene and the facts of the case.
It just amazes me that some people who are hell-bent that these 3 men are guilty, they'll hang on to those quote-unquote confessions and just refuse to believe that they could be false. But all the details are so different. It's beyond
You said it earlier. It was the perfect storm with all the satanic panic. And I'm trying to convince a jury. I was one of the first lawyers to ever present a false confession defense to a jury. And if Judge Burnett hadn't done what he did during the deliberations, I think we might have pulled it off.
Yeah, that was a shocker.
Of course, I was young and naive and still thought that the justice system was about truth and justice, not convictions at all costs or any cost or through any method. I still had those rose-colored glasses from law school on. I went to law school to find truth and justice, and I wanted to be a criminal defense lawyer. So I didn't find any truth and justice in this case, and there still hasn't been any. All there has been is a release. And I'll never forget my fiance and I, of course, Leanne and I got married a few years later, but we went down the elevator to watch the post-game show.
Yeah.
That the prosecutors were putting on. And I wasn't familiar with that courthouse to know where I was going down the elevator. And I was deposited along with Leanne right in the middle of the prosecutor's interview with the media and their press. So I just wanted to melt into the wall. I had no place to go. There was no way to go but back in the elevator and go up. And I thought that would appear odd. So I just thought I'd try to melt into the wall. And then one of the reporters asked Mr. Ellington, "Well, if you think they're guilty, why are you letting them go? If you think they killed 3 8-year-old kids, why are you letting them go?" And I thought, surely he's prepared for that obvious question. If I'd have been him, I wouldn't even have held the press conference. I'd have just went to my office and shut the door. But
yeah,
he said, "Well, I just hope they've rehabilitated themselves."
Oh,
and
unbelievable.
That was the response. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And Lonnie Sowery, who was working for primarily the Echols camp, but sort of became the spokesperson and press guy for the defense team. He looked at me after Ellington and his deputies went back upstairs, and he said, "Judge, do you want to say a few words, answer a few questions?" And I looked at him and I shook my head and I said, "Nope, I'm going to take a pass on this one." And he looked at me and he shook his head and he said, "I get it." And I didn't know enough about what had just happened to even have a response to any questions. And so I just left town to get away from the media. I didn't want to, talk about something I didn't fully grasp yet.
Right.
And so I actually missed all the media coverage that took place in that weekend after the plea. And so when I went back and started looking at some of those old news articles, it became obvious what had occurred.
Mm-hmm.
I got a couple people to speak off the record, and I stated that they were off the record. But if what they were telling me was true, it certainly corroborated other things in the case that I knew to be true. During that 10 years, I had very detailed billing records of where I was every minute of the day during that 9 months that we got to prepare for trial. I had newspaper articles. I'd saved every newspaper article. And, of course, we had the documentaries to go through and in the record of the case. Mm-hmm. So I triangulated all these sources to make sure I had the dates correct. There was one hearing that we held on the issue of mental retardation and whether the death penalty could be imposed on Mr. Misskelley if he was convicted. He shouldn't have been allowed to stand trial at all.
Right.
But I thought that hearing took place at a different courthouse than where it was actually held. And that bothered me that I didn't remember that. But of course, it had been 25 years at that point.
Yeah.
And I read the newspaper and looked at my billing records, and we were in Jonesboro when that happened. So I just don't remember it that way. It's funny how the mind is malleable in that regard. But that's why I took such great care and took plenty of time to make sure that everything in that book was truthful.
Yeah.
I haven't had anyone yet tell me that there's anything untruthful in there.
That's good news. Someone will tell you.
But normally they'll immediately point it out. And I'm sure that I probably somehow got a date wrong or something insignificant wrong. But everything else is exactly the way it happened. And of course, I could not talk about what I talk about in the book at the time before we thought we were getting a new trial, because you don't want to criticize someone that you're hoping to get a favorable ruling from someday in order to get a new trial.
True.
So yep. I had to keep all this stuff to myself, even though I haven't talked to. Well, I've talked to one of the documentarians, Amy Berg, several times on the phone. I don't think she's read the book yet. I hope they're not angry with me because I didn't divulge this information at the time, but I couldn't, or I had to keep it all bottled up because the client comes first. And I couldn't discuss any of this stuff until they were completely out of danger. And of course, life happens. In 2016, I had an opponent for the first time, and my opponent was dug up by Judge Burnett in my foes in the Misskelley case. Judge Burnett would walk around in my courtroom trying to talk people into running against me right in front of me.
Unbelievable.
And in 2016, he was successful, but he should have been more concerned about his own race because he lost his Senate seat, and I won by 61-39 margin.
Well, the truth will always come to light, and let's always hope the good guys win. So I think in that case you did.
Most of the time when I sign a book at a book signing, I put for truth and justice, may they always prevail. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my go-to. And of course, if I know someone personally, I'll add a personal message to that. But that's what this is about, truth and justice. And it was a long time in coming. And when it did arrive, it was imperfect in many, many ways. And every time I do a book signing, someone will come up to me and say, well, I was with so-and-so when this happened. And I said, what? And I said, yeah. And I won't go into details because I've already spoiled enough of the book already. But Mr. 11 out of 10, he was quoted in Paradise Lost. He was quoted as saying, I wish somebody would come and talk to me so I could explain to them how this happened. And so after the Alfred Pleas occurred, a reporter, Sean Flynn, who was writing an article for GQ magazine, and Joe Berlinger, who was one of the documentary's producers and directors in the Paradise Lost trilogy, he asked me to kind of show Sean around, and we met with Mr. Misskelley, and it was amazing walking around the streets of Memphis and people walking up to Mr. Misskelley and say, "I knew you were innocent. I'm so glad you got out of prison.
Oh.
I've known it for years." And Sean Flynn was a quick study. And because Mr. 11 out of 10 wanted to explain the case and how it really happened and why they were guilty, didn't return Mr. Flynn's phone call. And the prosecutor didn't return a phone call. And one of the detectives, who's now the sheriff of Greene County, didn't want to be interviewed, but he did call Mr. Flynn and say, "Hey, I'm not interested." So at least he had the decency to do that.
Right.
But Sean Flynn summed it up probably better than anybody could. He said there was no evidence, and this was nothing but a well-told campfire story, because there is absolutely zero evidence other than Misskelley's crazy, ridiculous, false confession.
Yeah.
Which is well documented and well destroyed and dismantled by all of the experts who came in and testified that the wounds on the bodies were not ritualistic killings with a knife. No knives were used. I remember seeing the video of Warner Spitz testifying in west of Memphis that there were no signs of knife wounds. This was all animal predation. And so there were head wounds, blunt force trauma to the heads of the victims.
Right.
But I don't really think the bindings, they described it always as being hogtied, and they really weren't. It was left wrist to left ankle.
Not crossed.
And vice versa, but they weren't crossed in the back. So they could have just easily reached down and got the shoestrings in front of them and got away. They wouldn't have been able to go very fast, but I think those ligatures were carrying handles that the truck driver or whoever used to dump the bodies in the ditch. They weighed about 50 pounds, which I just find it so disheartening that even faced with the truth that these folks wouldn't back down. There's not going to be any, even though this was a human atrocity, countered with another human atrocity of wrongful convictions of 3 innocent kids, they wouldn't back down. They wouldn't do it. And when you tell a kid who's been in jail for 18 years and 78 days, if you just say you did it, you get to go home, who can turn that down? I wouldn't have.
Time for one last word from my sponsors. It sounded like Jessie did well in prison.
Well, he had structure for the first time in his life. He had a place to sleep and 3 meals a day and a job, and he thrived, which was one of the strange ironies of the case. He didn't deserve to be there, but he actually thrived in the environment. And the whole thing is just sad. And the saddest part of all, of course, is the loss of those 3 8-year-old kids who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And with a little bit of luck and a little bit of grace from the good Lord, maybe we can solve this thing. I certainly want to. So we're going to keep on moving forward.
That is really good to hear. I'm so glad. Yeah, Stevie, Christopher, and Michael deserve their real killer to be found, taken off the street. That's not even to mention the fact that Jessie, Jason, and Damien deserve to be completely exonerated, and they deserve whatever reparations the state will give to them because they lost so much time.
They did, and you can't get that back. And now that I'm 61 instead of 30, I look at the world differently, and losing a child changes your perspective on that. You want to take advantage of every day you're given on this earth. And I've got a grandson and 3 granddaughters who I cherish, and I'm genuinely excited about watching them grow, and they're growing fast. I'm sleeping through the night for the first time in years. In fact, I get 7 or 8 hours per night now. My doctor has experimented with medications, and I'm taking a time-released sleep aid now that makes me go to sleep and kicks me asleep.
That's great.
Instead of tossing and turning.
Yeah.
No nightmares since I published the book.
Oh, thank goodness. I was going to ask you about that.
I came across those photographs of those 3 kids the other day. I was looking for something, and when you're looking for something, you always find something else. And I opened up a 3-ring binder, and there they were, all those photographs again. And I used to could set it in my office and spread those photographs out on the conference table in my library and eat a pepperoni pizza, and it wouldn't bother me. It only started bothering me when the trial was over and I'm not in combat anymore. And I'm not trying to make it sound like I was in combat, like in military sense, but I was in combat with the state of Arkansas. It was a 18-year and 78-day game of chess. It's actually still going on. That's when it hits you, is when you're used to consuming vast amounts of information and making split-second decisions in the courtroom. And you wake up the next day and it's like, what do I do now? Try to build my practice back. We almost ended up in a bankruptcy type situation because we just devoted so much time to this case. And luckily we were able to avoid that. I was not the most popular lawyer in the world at the time of the trials because people in my hometown couldn't understand why I would agree to represent a kid who was accused of killing 3 8-year-olds. And then I became the Don Quixote of Paragould, Arkansas, tilting at windmills that didn't exist. And then by 2007, when the DNA came out, excluding the West Memphis 3 and including others, suddenly it's like, I knew you were right the whole time.
Where were you?
Yeah, so it's been up and down. And with regard to my ex-wife, I hold no animosity. We get along better now than we ever have.
Good.
And maybe Jimmy Buffett was right. Hell, it could be my own damn fault.
Well, you were fighting the good fight.
It takes a lot of energy. And the last 30 years, I just blink. It seemed like it happened. All this happened yesterday. But life went on. But I was so obsessed with getting these kids out of prison. I just, in all my spare time, I had to make a living because I had 4 children, a house payment and car payments, and I had a law practice to attend to, but I never stopped working on the case. Even after I became a witness, I became the head cheerleader for the case until Judge Burnett issued his gag order that he didn't call a gag order. He told me I'd be thrown in jail for contempt if I talked to the media. And the courtroom they chose for the Rule 37 was the same courtroom they chose for the Alfred Plea. And I'm pretty sure, I'm not that familiar with that courthouse, but I'm pretty sure if it's not the smallest courtroom they have, it was one of the smallest. And that was by design, so the media wouldn't be in there, even though there was a camera in the courtrooms. Well, Judge Burnett was long gone by then. It's not a coincidence that within less than a year, these kids were out of prison. After he became a senator, he couldn't be a judge anymore. And so they reversed Judge Burnett and appointed Judge Laser, and within a few months, they're out of prison. Again, it's not perfect, but at least they're out of prison. And another reason I wrote the book is I just, in addition to wanting there to be a truthful story and do away with all these conspiracy theories and all these mythologies that exist about the case, I just didn't want there to be another Jessie Misskelley in the world. I didn't want anybody else to suffer this kind of fate. And so by telling the story, it's basically a case study on what you're not supposed to do in a criminal trial. And so I enjoy going around the country and speaking about the case and looking forward to getting out and doing more book signings. I got a big one coming up in a couple of weeks in Little Rock. And ironically, the first interview I did after the book came out was from Sweden. We're selling books everywhere around the world. It's amazing. Amazon has a footprint virtually everywhere. We've sold books in Japan, Mexico, the UK, Australia, Canada, the US, of course, is the biggest market. But just from the interviews I did in the UK for The Sun and the Daily Mail, book sales increased 20% almost overnight.
Wow.
So people have always been fascinated with this case. And
Yeah.
I'm not trying to sound like an idiot, but my guess is you and I won't be here. In fact, no one that's on the planet will be here in 300 years, but this could happen again. And it may not take 300 years, but they'll still be talking about this case for hundreds of years. It's one of the cases of the century.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you on that. What do you think we could learn from this case to protect children in the future, both from being harmed and from being wrongfully accused or convicted?
Well, what I've learned about helping kids based on watching my wife work for we've been together for off and on for almost 15 years. And I've watched her do her work, and every April, they publicize Child Abuse Prevention Month, and they put pinwheels out everywhere, and they do all these seminars on people who are supposed to report child abuse, and apparently it's working.
Good.
Because Arkansas has the most child abuse reports than any other state in the country. If you advertise, you got to call this in. In fact, it's a crime not to call it in. I'm a mandated reporter myself. And a lot of these cases go unreported. So in some of these states that don't have nearly as many cases, they just sometimes handle this in the family. As gross and horrendous as that sounds, but that's how they used to do it in the old days. Somebody would take a baseball bat and solve the problem. But that didn't solve the problem with the kid and all the trauma that they sustained. And
No,
of course,
not at all.
it's not uncommon for her to get child death reports. And those are the tough ones because they don't have a voice when they're that young, and interpreting injuries is difficult. And of course, the parents are going to deny most of the time what happened. And
of course,
so it's a sad job. And I've, like I said, I've watched my wife do it for years. And it's just like, what are we accomplishing with all this? It's not, how do we prevent it? What was the program they came out with? There was this dog with the trench coat. I can't remember his name.
McGruff, that's him.
McGruff. Yeah, the crime dog. Yeah.
There you go.
Stranger danger. They teach that at school. They teach it. The cops will go visit schools and put on the program, the DARE program, and talk about. But that stuff doesn't work. And the reason I know it doesn't work is because these kids fell for it. Whatever ruse was pulled on them. And I was on my way to my parents one night. This was years ago. In fact, I think my son Chris, who passed away, was with me. And there were some kids riding their bike down the street, not supervised, and they were pretty young kids. And I stopped the truck and rolled down the window, and I said, "Hey, I've lost my dog. Have you seen a dog running around?" And they said, "What color is it?" And I said, "It's yellow and has green polka dots." And one of the kids said, "Yeah, I saw that dog. He was running around right over there." And I obviously didn't ask them to get in the truck with me and take me over there because I didn't want to be weird about it. But it's easy to pick up a kid and kidnap a kid. And with all the human trafficking and sex trafficking that's going on, I support those groups wholeheartedly and have friends who run them. And their names are so long, I can't remember all the names. The National Association for Prevention of Child Abuse, I think, is one. They use cutting-edge technology to track down missing kids. I've seen it in action, and we're using it now in search warrants tracking. In fact, I think the seminar I went to learn how to do this, I was the only judge there, and everybody was surprised that a judge bothered to show up. But part of it was because my son-in-law was involved in it, but also I got CLE, continuing legal education hours for it. But I learned so much. And before I left the venue, we were in Arkansas, I signed a search warrant on a murder case that was unsolved in Paragould. And unfortunately, it didn't give us any results. But we can actually do search warrants and drop a pin and pick up what was going on the nearest cell tower nearby. And I'll never forget the case we had not too long ago where the guy who started this organization called the local police department here nearby and and said, "Hey, I think I can help you find this kid that was kidnapped from her home by some people they had driven from Washington State or Oregon. And this girl jumped out of her bedroom window and got in the car with these strangers. They had groomed her on the internet. And the police said, no, we don't need your help. We got the FBI coming in." And he said, "Look, I can help you do this if you'll just give me some basic information." And finally, the officer did. And within 2 hours, they located her in a McDonald's in Kansas.
Thank goodness.
So we saved one. I sign search warrants all the time. And technology changes, and it's dramatic.
Yeah, it's only getting better. And like I said, they're solving so many crimes from the past. It's heartening, actually. Hopefully this is one of them.
Well, I sure hope so. Nothing would make me happier to be able to keep the other two promises that I made. Unfortunately, Mr. Byers passed away in a car accident 2 years ago.
Yeah.
His wife had already passed away many years ago. And of course, the Moores were the only family members that still believe that the West Memphis Three are guilty. And Mr. Moore did a review on Amazon that said my book was a fairy tale. So,
oh, boy.
But the strange thing is, there's always been this small group of real vocal, they did it people. And they used to stalk me incessantly, and they'd blown up my mailbox twice.
That's crazy.
And since the book's come out, I haven't heard a peep. No one's made any threats. Nobody's said I'm an idiot or I got anything wrong. It's just like the paradigm shifted, which if that's the case, and I hope it is, that means I've reached my goals in writing the book.
Yeah.
So people can finally wrap their mind around a false confession and an Alfred Plea and see that there's just no evidence. And all the trickery and shenanigans that were going on, it's apparent. And then again, my mailbox could get blown up tomorrow.
I hope not.
I never leave home without a credit card and a weapon. So usually I have 2 or 3 within arm's reach at all times. But got very good security here at my home. It's hard to live in a small town and hide. You can't hide because of Google Maps and Google. So you just got to be safe and be vigilant. But I really haven't had any problems from the usual suspects who would harass me. But if you read my book and you still think they're guilty, then there's nobody that can convince you otherwise.
Right.
And nothing can convince you otherwise.
I agree. I think most people can tell where the fairy tale's coming from, and I do not believe it was your side of the story, that's for sure.
Well, it was, and I can assure you, and I am so glad that the truth is out there, and there's a actual record of what happened instead of all this crazy conspiracy stuff. And of course, Damien Echols didn't do anything to help matters with all his crazy magic and talk of Wicca and all this other stuff that people didn't understand. And in fact, I think that's an Elvis Presley quote. People are scared about things they don't understand.
They sure are.
It could be Bob the Painter, too. I guess. A happy accident.
There you go.
I fiddle around with painting, too. I just hadn't had an opportunity to do it in a long time. But I have lots of happy accidents when I'm painting.
That's it. Just turn it into something else. You did that with this case, I think. It started out as something very grim, and there's hope for the first time in possibly 30 years.
And all those publishers who said this case wasn't relevant are probably rethinking their position on that. But I'm glad we actually self-published, because I still have all my life story rights and copyright to my story. And the movie that they made, I was actually supposed to be the lead role in that movie, and turned down $100,000 because I didn't want to participate in something that was going to be a horror flick. And that's what it was. It wasn't factual and wasn't even very loosely based on the facts. This has never been about money for me. It's been about truth and justice. And if I somehow turn this into a bestseller, which I'm not that confident that that'll happen, I'll never be able to be compensated for all the hours and hours and hours that were put into this book project and the case itself. So it's not about money. It's about people knowing the truth, and they deserve to know the truth. And so I'm glad to tell my story.
That's awesome. If you could go back to the day you got that phone call asking, do you want to defend this possible child murderer, would you make the same decision?
Yeah, I would. I really would. And I didn't hesitate to answer that. And I even say in the book, it would have been much easier had I turned it down. Of course, I didn't know what I was getting into at the time. I thought my client was guilty and he was going to testify against the other two, but
right.
He was incapable of that despite all the crazy things the prosecutor did to try to make him testify. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast, and maybe at some point on down the road, you can have me back.
Absolutely. Anytime.
I really enjoyed our conversation. It's nice to be interviewed by someone who actually knows a little bit about the case. So
I'm surprised that's rare.
Well, the people have kind of heard about it on the peripheral. Strangely, our biggest audience is 18 to 35-year-olds, and they weren't even born or barely born at the time of this happened.
Right.
So this case is taught in college and law school and even high schools. I spoke to high schools that it's in the curriculum.
Wow. That's impressive. And I imagine that the case is probably everywhere you look on TikTok, so that's where a lot of them are getting it too.
Yep. I just want to get the word out to as many people so that this never has to happen again. And I had to teach my kids at an early age to never, ever, ever, and this sounds strange, but never, ever, ever talk to the police.
Right.
Because it's a situation, there's nothing to gain from it. Even if you're completely, totally innocent, like these kids were, bad things can still happen. You could admit to being somewhere that was near the crime that happened. You could inadvertently say something that casts doubt on your innocence. And the best thing to do is just not talk to the police. And that may sound strange coming from a judge.
No.
But that's what I did. I taught my kids to not talk to the police. And they were to ask for their lawyer and their dad. They happened to be the same person.
Right. Well, and that's a good way to help future teenagers or even children from being wrongfully accused.
Well, thank you so much for letting me come on, and I truly, truly enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much, Judge. I did too, and I thank you again for everything that you've done for all of these kids. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your kind words. I appreciate them so much.
Massive thanks to Judge Dan Stidham for taking the time to talk with me. It was an honor and a privilege to speak with him. Again, please check out his book, A Harvest of Innocence, which is available on Judge Stidham's website and on Amazon. Again, check out the show notes for links. That's it for this episode. Join me next time for another child's story. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/stlcpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/stlcpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Lane. Intro theme music is by Dreamnote Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.